How do we style our Next application? How do we style our components? Generally, that is totally up to you. Next.js supports styled components. You can use regular HTML code with regular selectors, classes, and so on. And you can also use CSS modules. And the support for the latter is actually already built into a Next.js project. Now that is what I'm going to use here, so that we have scoped CSS styles, scoped to specific components, at least if we want to, but you can definitely also explore other approaches for styling components. Now you will notice that we have this styles folder here, and in there we have a globals CSS file. Now here I set up some global CSS styles for you, and as I just said, you could of course add more classes here and then simply, set up any styles you want here. And you can also add more CSS files and, for example, import them in this app.js file where we are also already importing globals CSS. We haven't really learned what the role of this app.js file is, but for the moment you can keep in mind that here you could definitely import all your global CSS files. But I want to be able to scope styles to components, and therefore I will use the built-in CSS module support. Now, in case you don't know, CSS modules is all about setting up CSS code, which is then bound to a single component. So it does only affect that component and no other component. And that's a nice little feature which ensures that our styles don't spill over to other components. Now, therefore, I will create a separate CSS file for the event item component, a CSS file where I will define the styles for that component. And I could create that CSS file in the styles folder and import it from there, and that would work. But I will create it next to the event item.js file so that component code and component styles are located in the same place. That is a convention I like to follow. It makes it easier to find the styles for a given component. Therefore, here we add a new CSS file. We could name it event item, but to unlock this CSS module feature, this file actually has to end with .module.css. So event-item.module.css. The part here, event-item, that's up to you. That does not matter. But the ending, .module.css, that is important. Now with that, we can save this file, and now in event-item.js, we can import this file. We can import a CSS file into a JavaScript file, and behind the scenes, the Next.js build process will take care about that. It will basically extract the CSS code, change the selectors a little bit to scope them to this component HTML code, and inject it into the running page. We don't need to worry about that. We just need to import our CSS file, our event-item.module.css file. However, not just like this. Instead, we import classes or styles. The name is up to you. I'll go with classes from event-item.module.css. This is required for using this CSS modules feature. This classes thing here will be an object where all the CSS classes we define in this CSS file will be exposed under their class names so that we can assign them to HTML elements. This is required because the CSS class names we will add in this CSS file will be transformed under the hood by the build process to make them unique for this component. I also do talk about that in my React the Complete Guide course, in case you want to dive a bit deeper. Therefore, we import classes from this CSS file, and then we can, for example, go to our list item here, add the class name property, the class name attribute, and set this equal not to a string, but instead to a dynamic value specifically to some key we get from this class's object. And here that should be the item key. Now in the CSS file, we can add an item class selector. So that name here has to match that name which we're accessing here. And now we can define the styles in here, which will be applied to only this list item. So even if we would use the item class here, let's say in the event list component, if I would add this kind of class name here, even then these styles set up here would not affect this one here, this unordered list item. Because with the CSS modules feature, the class name we assign here in the CSS file will be changed under the hood behind the scenes, and it will no longer be item once the application runs in the browser. Therefore, to get this magically changed file name, we get access to those transformed class names under this imported classes object, and we then access our originally assigned class name and get access to the actual transformed class name and assign this as a class name to the list item then. It sounds confusing? Let me show it to you. If we temporarily give this a color of red, so if that's the style we assign, and we then save all the files, if I now reload and I then inspect this here, you will see that this list item has a class of event-item _item __ some unique hash. And that's not the class name we defined in the CSS file. Instead, that is this transformed class name, and the link is made through our assignment of classes.item here. So that's now working under the hood, and it allows us to scope our CSS styles to a selected component. Now with that, attached you find two CSS files which I prepared for you. Because this course is no CSS course, I don't want to bore you with writing CSS code, and therefore attached you find the event-item.module CSS file and the event-list.module CSS file. And you should replace your event-item.module.css file with the attached one, and also add the event list module CSS file to this events folder in this components folder. Then, back in the event item.js file, we now need to assign more CSS class names. We should add classes.item on the list item, so on the li element, but then on this first div here, you should also add a class name of classes.content. Then on the div in there, add a class name of classes.summary. No class name on the h2 tag. On this div here, we add a class name of classes.date. No class name on the time element. On this div here, we add a class name of classes.address. And then here on this div, which holds the link, we add a class name of classes.actions. So these are a couple of class names we assign. And now we also need to go to the event list component and add some styles there. For this, in this event list component, we first of all also need to import classes from /event-list.module.css. And then on the unordered list item element, we add the class name prop and set this to classes.list. Because in this CSS file which I provided to you, there is a list class defined. And then with that, you should see that if you now reload, you have something like this on the screen. Still not the final look of everything, but a good step closer. Now, as a next step, let's work on this link and let's add a couple of icons.